suppose we're 10 years old this year. We still think of ourselves, and I hope we still act like an energetic startup, but I guess to some extent we've got some projects under our belt, and over the last decade we've been having a lot of fun. I slightly feel I was a late starter, so my trajectory was I trained at Cambridge in the AA. I then took some time out and worked in the theatre as a set lighting and pretty disastrously costume designer for a while. Set up my own practice with a very good friend who's now at Richard Rogers, or I should say Rogers Stirk Harbour Partnership. And we were RSHP, thank you, Peter, yeah. And we were spectacularly unsuccessful. And I got a job colouring in at KPF. And that was for me a real steep and wonderful learning curve. I mean, I guess thinking back, and we're talking late 80s, UK architecture was rather beleaguered. We had the whole Prince Charles debates, and I think the feeling was confidence was at a low ebb. And to be in this practice of Americans in Covent Garden, they had no interest or concern about Prince Charles. They were doing great work all over the world, and I really enjoyed the confidence. And KPF got asked to do a little competition for the University of Oxford for a Centre for American Studies, and Bill Pedersen in New York was going to do it. And then Bill got asked to go on a husky trail in Alaska. And much to his credit and evidence of his appropriate work-life balance, he went to Alaska and left me to do the competition, which we were fortunate enough to win, and even more fortunate to get to build the building. And that was, you know, a fantastic privilege. We were working next to Basil Champney's Mansfield College and Baker's Rhodes House, 2 Grade 1 listed buildings, and we built what I still feel was a good building. And my son, studying history at Oxford, works in the reading room that we have, looking out over the garden quadrangle that we framed, and I didn't anticipate that when we were doing the building, but you know, that's a source of enduring pride and pleasure. And I rose to be a partner at KPF, and broadly was kept in the back room designing things, and I was completely happy. Come the financial crisis of 2008, it led very unfortunately to some tension between KPF's London and New York office, and I and the other London partners ventured out to set up a practice called PLP Architecture, and that for me was a very unsettling time. We left without very much work, and I realised it wasn't still sustainable to sit in the back office waiting for stuff to come to me, and so I got out on the road with my fellow London partners, and we tried to secure some work. And I remember getting a project with Crossrail, now delivered, the Farringdon East Crossrail, which Native Land delivered. And this was hugely exciting because you were talking to total strangers, phoning up people, and I'm very diffident and don't enjoy doing that, and trying to persuade them to give us a job. And it was sort of financially pretty critical that we succeeded. And I suppose that experience gave me the confidence to try and do it on my own. So in 2013, I left with the 5 partners I'm working with here at Pilbrow and Partners, and we were in a very similar situation. We had no work. And the difficulty was that my experience, their experience, was on large, complex projects, the sort of thing we enjoy, difficult planning challenges. And when you start, there's always a slight question mark about whether someone will trust you to do a sort of large-scale thing, or are you back doing rear extensions? And we were super fortunate to win a little competition in Greenwich for Quintain, which then became a project for Night Dragon. And that project was delivered, and I guess it gave people confidence that we were a safe pair of hands, and that's really where we started. So on M&S, obviously it's been a marathon, not a sprint, and I don't think we're at the end of that race. We obviously secured consent from Westminster, ratified by the Mayor. We then had a public inquiry, also secured the inspector support on that, and we've fallen at the last hurdle, to pursue that racing metaphor, with Mr. Gove's refusing the scheme. I think Marks and Spencers are challenging that, and we wait to see what the result will be. But the inquiry for me was a really important opportunity to test some of the debates that have been occasioned by that proposal, because quite properly there's been an increasing focus on embodied carbon as buildings have both become more energy efficient, and we're pretty interested in that space. And I think maybe you can see dimly behind me, this is the Edge building that we're on site with down next to the Shard in London Bridge, and it will be London's most energy efficient multi-tenant building. As buildings have become more energy efficient, the proportion of carbon involved in their construction and maintenance has grown. And obviously that's given sharper focus as the grid itself decarbonises. So the M&S inquiry, and then the inspector acknowledged this, was really the first to consider embodied carbon. And there was, I think, to my view, a somewhat simplistic assumption that retrofit is always going to be low embodied carbon and always the right thing to do, and new build is going to be high embodied carbon and always the wrong thing to do. Well, I had the opportunity of taking the inspector to see our Kensington building, which we refurbished for Peter Ferrari's Ashby Capital. I think it finished late last year. And it took a former department store, a brutalist concrete framed building on Kensington High Street, Pontings, which was one of the 3 department stores on the street, and we cut and carved and remodeled that building. And the results, hopefully, were very positive. We delivered some fantastic new retail, new permeability, including a route to the adjacent underground station. We increased both the quality and quantum of workspace in the building, and I think the building has been judged both a critical and commercial success. I confess we didn't design it with football clubs in view, but Manchester United have taken the top floor. We have a hedge fund below them, and then on the second floor we have Luxottica, who are an Italian eyewear manufacturer. And all of those tenants came to the building because it's got very good well-being as well as environmental sustainability credentials. So I took the inspector round the Kensington building, and I explained to him that I think 2 things were of relevance to the M&S inquiry. First, the quality of the building you start with really matters. And in Kensington, we started with a single building, which had generous floor-to-ceiling heights, an open and regular structural grid, and we'd also had the benefit of high floor loadings, which allowed us to extend the building both vertically and horizontally. None of those opportunities exist at Oxford Street. We have 3 buildings, none of which were originally purpose-designed for multi-level retail, each of which is individually compromised in terms of their structural grids, with columns as close as 2-metre centres, compromised in terms of their floor-to-ceiling height, and very compromised in terms of their core disposition. And the difficulty we get is that when you put the 3 in aggregate, those problems multiply. Floors misalign. Column grids are skewed in relation from building to building. And the result is, and anyone who's been to the M&S will know this, an interior that is chaotic and compromised. And I think the difficulty we have is that bricks and mortar retail simply got tougher. You have to provide a better environment because otherwise people just do it online. And we've seen how other multi-level department stores on Oxford Street have closed as trading conditions have changed. I think the inspector picked up that point because he asked Simon Sturgis, who was giving evidence on behalf of SAVE, could he give an example of any similarly compromised buildings that have been successfully refurbished? And his report notes that he didn't get an answer to his question. So I made that point to the inspector, but I also made a second point, which is actually the Kensington building is undoubtedly successful in urban terms, in the quality of the workspace, in the public realm. It's going to be very energy efficient as a building to operate, and it involves some of the latest sensor technology which marries high well-being with low energy. But it's not particularly low embodied carbon, and this is a point I feel strongly about, that actually the works that are needed to retrofit and repurpose existing structures can require quite a significant investment in embodied carbon. If we look, to use the jargon, at the A1A5, the embodied carbon up to practical completion, in Kensington it's about 700 kilograms of carbon per square metre. Well, the building that we propose at 458 Oxford Street for M&S is lower than that. It's about 654. And so it tells you that retrofit first, but not retrofit only, and retrofit can be associated with low embodied carbon, but isn't always delivering that. Well, the inspector heard those arguments. He saw my cross-examination, and he saw the cross-examination of people like Simon from SAVE, and he came to the conclusion that we were doing the right thing and supported our scheme. Mr. Gove demurred. We'll see whether M&S are able to successfully challenge that. Certainly, I believe strongly that for the future of Oxford Street, which is today in quite a lot of difficulty, it's an important project, and I hope that one benefit that comes out of the lengthy and expensive inquiry process is we now have a better set of information on which we can judge schemes. And the City of London, I think, were quite far-sighted in this respect. I think Gwen Richards and colleagues commissioned Hilson Moran to say, how might we rigorously appraise schemes, and how might we look at their both operational and embodied carbon characteristics at a pre-application stage? And we now use that as a model on all our projects, because we believe good decisions are based on good evidence. In 2018, we were approached by Edge to help them look at a site on St Thomas Street. It's one of 4 sites within the East St Thomas Street development framework that identifies a cluster of tall buildings adjacent to the Shard. And Edge have been pioneers in both delivering environmentally efficient buildings, but also buildings that deliver on high well-being standards. And they believe, and I think I concur, that for the workplace to be successful, it's got to provide a rich and stimulating environment. The terrible jargon being you've got to earn the commute, but basically you want to create an environment that's conducive to the meeting and exchange of ideas. They nicely have a policy they adopt across their global portfolio that every building they do has to be better than all the previous ones. So they have a blue book, and the blue book standards rise as they complete each project. So ours will be the most sustainable within their portfolio. They bring a lot of passion as a client. They always want to do better. So, for example, I think the scheme was 55% better than Part L regulations when we secured consent for it. And most developers would deliver the building but do no more. They've continued to push. So, for example, we now have an energy sharing agreement with Greystar, who are doing student residential next door. So waste heat from our office building, rather than being thrown away, goes to heat the student units next door. We've been in discussion with Tesla about a battery pack to allow us to use electricity generated when the grid is at its lowest carbon. It also gives resilience to the building in operation. We've been working with Scheldebau to develop photovoltaics within vision panels so that we can make a south elevation that is both shading the interior and generating power for the building. And all of those measures has increased the energy efficiency. I think we're now 80% lower than Part L. And Edge are remorseless, and they continue to push us to improve the building. They took a similar attitude on embodied energy. So it's a tall building, 28 stories. The embodied carbon was about 840 kilograms of carbon. Mesar, excellent main contractor delivering the building, have a contractual commitment to drive the embodied carbon down by 20%. And we've been working across every aspect of the design with them to see how we might further reduce the embodied carbon. And one really exciting aspect of that is, as you mentioned, Peter, the structural timber in the building. So it's, I guess it's a hybrid structure. We have a post-tension concrete superstructure developed with our engineering colleagues at AKT, which provides a super frame for the building. So every 4 stories, concrete goes all the way through, and that is providing compartmentation to zones of timber within the building. And we like timber for a couple of reasons. The concrete is both very efficient. We use it to temper the internal environment using thermal mass, but it isn't very flexible in that it doesn't like you making holes in it, so it's post tension and would tend to react badly to that. So the timber is very flexible as a material. I think it's aesthetically very beautiful, it's low carbon, and it allows you to make connections between adjacent floors. And in a way, that aspect of the building develops an interest I've had on over a number of years. So I was working at KPF on Heron Tower, and I was interested in how we delivered really good daylight into the interior. So we have a series of 3-story north-facing atria, and they sort of serve to combine adjacent floors. And I likened it to a stair hall of an English country house. It's a sort of grand but not overbearing space, a social space that still feels human in scale, not a slot all the way through the building, but a kind of a 3-story room. And the soft spots within the edge building, that 3-level timber infill, I think will work in a similar fashion, that you'll make connections where you want them, and that will provide a social focus for the floor plate. To some extent, though, it's a kind of development of Heron because it's more attuned to individual tenant demand. So much of the building will lease on a floor-by-floor basis, and those tenants will enjoy the timber ceiling, but they won't need the connections. Other tenants may want 2, 3, 4, or in the case of recent conversation we've been having on Edge, 10 floors, and those tenants can make the connections where they want them. So rather than prescribing a kind of 3-story module as I did on Heron, we're really making a flexible kit of parts that can be attuned to need. And what's been fascinating in the dialogue we've had, for example, on this tenant looking at 10 floors, is that they really love that because it's their canvas and they can decide how they want to configure it and reconfigure it to respond to their need. And I suppose as an architect, one comes away with that thinking, okay, so we shouldn't be too prescriptive, start the conversation, but have the courtesy to allow others to finish it. We've sort of become expert in life sciences. We've become very involved in that sector. We've worked up in Cambridge doing a great laboratory for bicycle therapeutics who build protein scaffold for cancer drug delivery. And what I like about it is it's both very technically demanding and complex, but at the same time, a kind of interest in lively, stimulating, sociable workspace fully applicable. And we try and bring both those two strands together. So yeah, we're doing that. I mean, kind of bizarrely, at the same time, we've been working for rock and rollers and doing a lot of work in culture and music and entertainment. So we're doing a little building up in King's Cross on York Way for Tileyard Studios, who are a specialist agglomeration of music and entertainment businesses. They've got about 400 companies there, and if you're making your way in that business, you go to the Vinyl Cafe, and that's where you make the connections that work. And it's a really powerful example of how clustering transforms economic outlook. We've been doing the EMD restoration with Waltham Forest and Soho Theatre. This was a bit of a labour of love. So Mark Godfrey at Soho Theatre, who's a resident up in Walthamstow, had been very involved in community action to save this amazing building. So the EMD, originally a Granada mega cinema, was designed by Cecil Massey and Komisarevich, who was a white Russian emigre interior designer. And Komisarevich really liked that it was called the Granada Cinema Group and said, Granada, well, that's the Alhambra. And the interior, regional capacity 2,700, is this astonishing Moorish fantasy, really beautiful. And so we worked for about 3 years with Soho Theatre and the local community, I confess unpaid, to see if we could find a viable route to restore the building. And what Soho wanted to do was make a centre for comedy principally. And comedy is quite good from a business case because you basically need one microphone and one comedian. So its cost of production is quite low, and they could show from their Dean Street base that there was strong demand for the product they're doing. They did also want to do panto and music and other stuff as well, but the core thing was comedy. And perhaps because the scheme looked to be viable in the longer term and wouldn't require ongoing subsidy, Waltham Forest, I think very, I was going to try and find a word other than brave, but I'll use brave. I mean, very bravely came in and backed the scheme. And up till then, we've been trying to find routes where, you know, enabling development would help fund the restoration, but there was always a big viability gap. And now the council are behind the scheme, and it will open next year and will be really beautiful. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing building. And rather nicely, Soho's attitude was, although it was originally this extraordinary kind of Moorish, spectacular space, it's had lots of other lives. So it's been a multiplex, it's been a bingo centre, it's been a centre for live performance. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones played there, and they were very concerned that we shouldn't scrape off all of that other layering, and that you can enjoy all of the history.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, guffed on too long. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that.